It's a lot easier to win combats when you get to hit the opponent before they get to hit you, so let's talk about a couple of ways of doing that with the fights first and fights last mechanics. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. In today's video we're going to be focusing on the mechanics of units that get to fight before all others, and units that make enemy units fight last. These two have been popping up more and more throughout 9th edition, and more codexes than don't do seem to have at least one ability to make enemy units fight last. Some have absolutely tons of them. I must admit, when the 9th edition core rules came out, it was one of the areas that seemed a little bit more confusing to me, and it was only really made all that clear when Games Workshop issued an FAQ in summer this year, and basically spelled out exactly what the sequence of events for the charge and fight phase were if you had these rules in play. In the video we'll just talk a bit about how they work, the general sequence of events of which units get to strike in what order in the fight phase, and then which of the rules I think is more powerful, with some example situations where they could really help. So first up, let's talk about the rules and where they come up then. First up, as most people are well aware, usually in the fight phase one person charges the other person, the charging units all get to attack first and swing before the opponent, and then all the units that didn't charge but are still within engagement range, they get to swing alternately. The first one's chosen by the player that didn't do the charging, and then the charging player gets to select one of their units, and so on until all the units are done. It gives you a pretty big advantage to charging as you get to use the first strike, but it does mean that the non-charging player has a bit of an advantage in the units that didn't charge. You can also use that counter-offensive stratagem to interrupt with a unit, a really powerful use of 2 CP to get the jump on the enemy. Firstly, quite a lot of units have the fight first rule in 40k, usually with phrasing something like this: if a unit is in engagement range, it can fight first this phase. Interestingly, with the FAQ they clarify that charging units basically just have this rule, and charging units don't operate in any way differently to the other various units that might have a fight first rule. Say for example Slanesh Demons, Emperor's Children Chaos Space Marines, or maybe if you cast the Veil of Time psychic power on one of your Space Marine units. There's quite a few Warlord traits and options as well that also might allow your characters to fight first, regardless of whether or not they've charged. On the other hand, you have plenty of units in the game now that can make enemy units fight last, such as having a rule that says this unit may not be selected to fight until all the other units have done so this phase. This in particular is becoming more and more prevalent in 9th edition. We've got the Space Marine Judicia, the Obsiescence generators on the Silent King, the Tempercopia Admech relic and their Electroshocked stratagem, or the Incubi or the Ancient Evil Warlord trait from Drukhari. These basically mean that the units can't be selected until the end of the fight phase, and interestingly the way that it's worded means that you can't use that counter-offensive stratagem to interrupt in the fight phase if you have one of these rules making you fight last. As the unit isn't eligible to be selected to fight, then that stops you from being able to use the counter-offensive stratagem. Finally, and another clarification that they made in the FAQ, is that if you're affected by both the rules, say you have a fights first rule for being, say, Slanesh Demons, but you're also affected by a fights last rule, such as a Space Marine Judicia, then you just fight as if you had neither rule in effect whatsoever. Even if you have multiple fight first rules or multiple fight last rules, provided you're affected by at least one of each, then they both cancel out, and the unit just fights normally, so typically after charging units, but typically before any other units that were only going to be fighting last. It's interesting that as a charging unit is counted as fighting first, it means that if you charge an enemy that's fighting last, then actually you'll just be fighting normally, but that will still often be enough to put you behind the unit that you charged. So for a bit of a summary of the sequence of events, first of all you fight with fights first units, including any that charged, but the charging units aren't special or anything. The person who's doing the charging gets to pick the first unit out of these, thanks to the sequencing rule for the core rulebook, plus the extra FAQ that they issued for the always fights first and last rules. So say you had a lot of charging units and you were fighting against a bunch of Slanesh Demons, you'd get to pick the first unit that attacked, and then the Slanesh Demon player will get to pick the second one. Then you go on to any units that weren't fighting first for whatever reason. Say any units that were charged this turn but didn't do any charging, maybe were locked up in ongoing combats, or have both a fights first and a fights last ability applied to them at the same time. The non-charging player gets to pick the first one of these, and then you alternate between the two players until all the units in this bracket have fought. Any of these guys are perfectly good targets for the counter-offensive stratagem, as that could allow them to fight in the first bracket essentially after one of the fighting first units has just fought. I find it kind of interesting that you can actually use counter-offensive on a unit that's affected by a fights last ability, provided it also has a fights first ability going for it as well. So say you had a unit that charged a Space Marine Judicia, and he chose to make them fight last, It might even be worth using counter-offensive for 2 command points to interrupt with your charging unit if your opponent chooses to resolve other combats first. Finally, you strike with any units that have fight last rules on them, and again you start with the player who's doing the charging this phase, and as we said before from the FAQ, these guys can't use counter-offensive to interrupt. I must admit, I think that Games Workshop could do with using a little flowchart in their rulebook or something. This whole sequence of events just really isn't all that obvious, and I think it's particularly non-obvious that in steps 1 and 3 you start with a charging player's unit, and then in step 2 you start with a non-charging player's unit. The system does work quite well, I think, but it's not the most intuitive to get your head around. So let's just talk about how these rules might be applied in game then. Out of the 2 rules, I'd much rather have the fights last rule by quite a large margin. It just seems to be a lot more useful in the normal to and fro of combat. For example, here we have some AdMech Electro Priests who can make enemy units fight last with a stratagem that they have. They get charged by some Assault Intercessors, they can make the Assault Intercessors fight last, so the Assault Intercessors are being affected by a fights first rule, which is charging, and a fight last rule from the AdMech stratagem. That means that both units will essentially be fighting normally, but because the AdMech player is the non-charging player, those Electro Priests should have the chance to be selected for fighting first, as of course it's the non-charging player who gets to pick the first unit in step 2. That could easily be a really massive deal. The Intercessors will probably have wiped out the Electro Priests if they've got to swing first, but the Electro Priests might well just cut down the Intercessors simply because they have this fight last stratagem. Fights last can also be pretty handy when you're doing the charging as well, just because it stops a powerful enemy unit from using counter-offensive and interrupting. Say the Drukhari player here wants to take out this enormous unit of Assault Terminators in combat, and they want to charge them with 3 different units. If they had no fights last rule on the table, what would likely happen is that they'd swing with one of the units, maybe kill a few Terminators, and then the Terminators would interrupt for 2 command points, and then hopefully kill the rest of the Drukhari with their enormous squad. If however, say for example, the Archon has the Ancient Evil Warlord trait, he can make the big unit of Assault Terminators fight last, and that means they won't be able to interrupt, so the Drukhari player can swing with, say, the Incubi, then the Archon, then the Witches, knowing that the Terminators won't be able to fight until you've done all the damage that you can do to them. By that point you might have wiped out the unit, or only have a couple of them left, which would kill far less Drukhari models than they would have otherwise. Of course it's great in ongoing combats as well. If you're just putting a fights last ability on the opponent every turn, then you can guarantee that they're going to be fighting after you. On the other hand though, fights first just really doesn't seem to come up quite that often. In general, if you have just one unit getting charged, it's not actually going to help you strike first at all. Say for example, if these Fiends of Slaanesh get charged by the Assault Terminators, despite them having a fights first rule, typically the Terminators are going to be able to swing first if they want to. The Terminators also get their fights first rule just due to having charged, and as the charging player gets to pick the first unit, they'll likely pick the Terminators and smash the Fiends first. It also doesn't help if you're doing the charging either, as if you're doing the charging you would be fighting first anyway, so it's a bit of a redundant rule. And usually either charging or being charged are the 2 most common types of combat. Generally having a fights first rule is only all that helpful in ongoing combats that last over several turns worth of play. It's not entirely uncommon, but often one unit will wipe out the other one, or one of the armies will decide that they don't want to be in combat and decide to back out and retreat. I guess it could also allow you to use the interrupt stratagem if you are affected by a fights last rule, which could be useful, though again you still also have to spend the command points. I guess maybe one of the other most helpful fights first rules that you might get is if you have lots of fights first units within your army, and you happen to get charged by multiple units across the battlefield. For example, if the Space Marines charge the Terminators into the Fiends, and these Assault Marines into the Demonettes, the Space Marine player will get to pick the combat that they want to resolve first, but then after that the Slaanesh player will get to pick the next unit. That's only really useful though if you do have fights first across an entire army, which isn't all that common aside from things like Slaanesh or Emperor's Children. In general, I'd say that fights first is kind of nice to have, though it's kind of rarely something that I'd actually want to buy in. I don't think it's worth that much. Whereas having something that makes the opponent fights last somewhere on the table can be a massive advantage for any sort of melee army, whether you're doing the charging or being charged. Feel free to let me know if I've missed anything or misunderstood any rules while I've been making this. I'm sure there's plenty of other subtle interactions with these rules, particularly with some of the variations in wording across the codexes. Look forward to hearing your thoughts and ideas down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k stuff coming, with new videos coming out just about every day. Finally, if you'd like to help support the channel and keep these videos coming, I would just like to mention the Auspex Tactics Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next for the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.